nice to talk around. If it's up, if you guys are up for it, it'd be really nice to have a bit more of a conversation. It's quite a broad topic, and I fell down a few rabbit holes pulling the slides together, because as much as this is a lot of my everyday work, you forget the sort of nuance of it when you're doing it all the time. So it sort of kept growing and growing. I was like, what? I don't even know what I'm doing a talk about anymore. So there's some stuff, and we're going to talk about this topic. So yeah, it'd be great if you guys want to get involved, and I'll take some questions and try and sort of steer the topic in a way so that you guys get the most from it. So yeah, I'm Neil. I'm really lucky. I work for a company called Ecosulis, and we're a 30-year-old consultancy, habitats contractor and an ecological consultancy. And my job there is to develop projects. So that means I get to go all over the UK and help clients work out how they can do more for nature. That could be anything right from the very inception, from a half idea, not even a project or anything live yet, right up to the point of practical work. So yeah, it keeps me super engaged, and I get to meet lots of different interesting people and get to go kind of all over the place. So yeah, I shall sort of start diving into the detail. So I thought it'd be really good to start with why we need to do something different. So conservation's been rolling for a very long time. We've got some great practices, some great approaches, and we've got some lovely little gems of sites that have remained. But in the backdrop of all of that, we're still seeing declining biodiversity, and we're still losing more and more species quite regularly, and the numbers when you kind of look at them are quite alarming. And I was really fortunate that I used to look after a site down the road from here, Caversham Park. I was their head gardener from 2009 to 2013, and actually weirdly where I had a lot of my epiphanies about land management. It was such a strange opportunity, because my career had always been really practical, and when you're working practically, often I was on someone else's land or estates, so I would be asking them what they like and what they wanted me to do, and I'd be trying to find how there's a natural native version of that thing to sort of shoehorn in. So I got really good at shoehorning biodiversity in the background, and then I got to my role at BBC Monitoring, and I said, right, what do you want me to focus on? It's like, oh, it's up to you, Neil, you're the head gardener, as long as it's legal, as long as you know why you've done it, and accept the fact that 10 years after you've left, they might come and ask you why you did or didn't do certain things. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to need a minute. I don't know if you guys know this, you're looking down at Reading and Caversham and the 329M. So I was sat on the terrace, sat here with my coffee going, what am I going to do? Okay, it's not normally down to me. And I was looking at the traffic and all of the industry that we've got in Reading. I was like, I want to offset that with what we've got here. So that was just the first half thought of an idea, the first sort of plant of a vision. No more detail at that point. And actually what really helped catalyse what I got to do here was, strangely enough, a declining budget. So every year I was there, my budget went down by 50%. So as you guys probably know, being fairly local, BBC don't own BBC Monitoring in Caversham Park anymore. And at the time, I knew we were the only gardeners within the whole of the BBC. Everything was sort of outsourced. So anyway, here I think we had 92 acres, and it was a giant sandbox for me to experiment with. So what I did was I set about seeing what the site was saying and doing, and then releasing the reins bit by bit. And what was really interesting, and what kind of triggered something in me, was how quickly nature responded. So it's really easy to spend a lot of money on conservation, and when you're conserving things, you can spend a lot of time and energy forcing a habitat to a certain condition. And obviously with less time and people and money, I had to be really careful about what we did where. So the first thing I did was try and reduce our grass cutting regime. As you can see, my predecessor, bless him, did a fabulous job, but he cut every bit of grass every week for the entire year. And it looked green, and it looked like a picture postcard, but it looked like that, disappointingly, in my view, every day. You couldn't tell what time of year it was, or you couldn't see anything happening and any real diversity going on. So I started releasing the reins of what we were doing, reducing that kind of land management and that control. And over time, we managed to get all of this. We ended up with orchids coming up in all of this long grass. It's an awful picture, sorry, I couldn't find my old ones and I had to explore this from the internet, so it's a bit of a grainy shot. But this is the same site. This was lovely lush grass, and as you can imagine, with 500 employees, I upset lots of people changing the way in which this was managed, from striped, bright green lawns and beautiful flower beds that were grown on site and then thrown away and then grown again and then thrown away, which again seemed like quite a wasteful activity, but quite typical for these big manor houses. And so I was really bracing myself for what would happen when I released the reins on this site. And as you can imagine, as soon as you change the pressure that you get from managing land in a certain way, you get a bounce back, a new opportunity arrives. And as I'd expected, some things might fill that void quite quickly, and they might not be things we want longer term. And as expected, there was a spike in rat population. I braced our facilities manager and said that these are some of the things I'm suggesting, and there will be things that we might then have to attend to. But what really did catch me by surprise is how quickly nature found balance, even on this site. So yes, there was a spike in rat population. We were suddenly seeing them everywhere. But as it's coming into summer, all of a sudden we've got this change in predator behaviour on the site. So where 92 acres, we had one fox population, one fox territory, so one big male dog fox that ruled the roost, and a couple would tiptoe in but generally would be pushed off. As soon as we changed the management and left all of this sort of connectivity and long grass to start coming up from the site, all of the edges became rough. That territory size shrunk, and there were suddenly 4 fox populations on the same site in one growing season. We also had, I don't know if, again, you guys know, there's a little sort of canal here, there's a little copse below it, and for as long as my facilities manager could remember, 35 years of managing the site, there'd only ever been one buzzard pair that had every year come and nested in a big old oak that's down here in the copse. They came back, but they were joined on another part of the site by another buzzard, 2 kites and 2 kestrel nests, all in that one season. Both kites and kestrels had never been seen nesting. And as I said, as much as I upset lots of employees because they were like, I like to sit here and eat my lunch, I've done this, I was like, oh, okay, never mind. But you can't help but doubt yourself because you're upsetting people along the way. But what kind of got it to click for everyone else was when kestrels nested the following year on this stonework, and then everyone's out here eating their lunch, and the kestrels are swooping down in the long grass, collecting bowls, feeding the chicks, and they're like, oh, is that why? I'm like, yeah. And then suddenly everyone wanted to put trail cameras out and do walks and talks, and what else are you doing where? But so it showed that you did need that catalyst for everyone else, but it was also nice to validate the half idea that I'd sort of set out on. But what was even more interesting is that first winter after change was the first year that we didn't get rats in the manor house. As I said, my FM manager, 35 years he ran this site, and every year there was a massive challenge because, as you can imagine, BBC monitoring, there's cables everywhere in the basement, keeping all the dishes powered and all of the listening stations open. So yeah, that was a really powerful message about even just changing that mowing regime, allowing that land to start kind of coming back to life. So weirdly, that was me getting on with listening to the land and letting nature lead what I was choosing to do. That fed on into the next Jubilee that came at this point in time, and someone from Reading Council turned up to say, right, Neil, we'd like to talk about the Jubilee, we have a big drive for planting. I was like, yeah, oh, this sounds great. He's like, yeah, Hewlett Packard are planting a tree and so-and-so's planting a tree. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, well, I'm sure we'll do something. And he left, and I turned to Eddie and I said, Eddie, we've got 92 acres, I'm not planting one tree, that's offensive. He's like, yeah, I completely agree. He said, remember, you don't have much budget, you've got whatever's left in your pot. I think it was about 1,200 quid. He was like, and it obviously needs to fit with the fact that it's an English heritage house, the vistas are registered. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll get cracking with some ideas. So again, there's the lower field, so I decided to attach some woodland on the side of it. And I got my price for all my locally grown trees coming from Oxford, and I was like, oh, they're really cheap. They're like 12, 15, 35p a whip. I was like, these are great. What if I can spend all the budget on these plants? I was like, oh, but then there's all those stupid plastic guards everyone puts on them. And again, in my early career, I've had to go and cut these plastic guards off of trees. So I decided that I would start the idea of tree planting right at the beginning, which is, what do I want? Well, actually I want a future woodland. And what do I need to worry about? Oh, we get cows in the lower field, so I will need some stock fencing just to keep them out. I was like, well, actually we don't really have deer. We've got muntjac, and they seem to love all of the ornamental stuff, so all of the japonica species that are all around the manor house. That was all browsed intensively. But they didn't seem to ever eat a lot of the native trees that were growing, self-generating around the site. Occasionally a tree might get frayed upon, so that's the soft velvet. When the antlers regrow, they're just rubbing that off because it's really itchy. So I made a really bold decision in 2010 or whenever it was that I was going to do a planting job, plant it all with volunteers and not use any tree guards. And even now, people still go, oh, they're all gone, aren't they? And I happened to go on Google Earth, I should have put an image in. It's a really lovely natural wooded area that's kind of continued to grow. So I guess from my side, it's just highlighting the fact that there's always something we can do, but it's starting at the very beginning and say, what are we trying to achieve? For me, it was a new bit of woodland, and what's going to stop there being woodland? Well, actually, we've already got some trees, so if we can encourage those to grow themselves, we don't have these species, so I'll pick those and we'll introduce them. But actually, we don't need to worry about, if we keep the cows out, that's one thing, eating the trees, and we mow it occasionally, so if we keep me out with a tractor, that's another thing that's not going to be removing the trees. And yeah, that was the sort of the journey that I went on this site. Scroll forward to 2017, I started doing some work for this guy Kane Blythe, who owns Ecosulis, and I was talking about some stuff I'd done at Cabbaging Park. He's like, Neil, you know this is rewilding. I was like, rewilding? What are you talking about? Yeah, it's like this. It's a whole science. This is like a thing. I was like, just makes sense. Like, listen to the land, see what you've got, see what's missing, and think about why it's not there one step at a time. And that's what sort of catalysed my journey into this space within rewilding that we call active rewilding. So obviously you've got what some people perceive as passive rewilding, which works really well for big areas, and that's what a lot of people jump straight to if you say the word rewilding. They think it's push everyone out, lock the gate and walk away, and in some locations that might be a really good thing to do. Generally within the UK context, we've simplified and modified the landscape so much that the underlying system isn't in a condition where that would do what you wanted it to do. So you're more likely to end up with some wildlife coming in because it's quiet, but actually you'd probably end up with a bit of a static state habitat, which would end up sort of plateauing quite quickly and having less diversity than some of the more managed areas would have had. So that was a little bit of a journey of how I entered, and that's a little bit of a bright shot with the light, but this is the other side of the house where we couldn't get grazing to take place. So we had loads of regen coming up, and every autumn before I cut the meadows, we would just walk out with an armful of bamboo canes, mark out all the regen, decide, oh, that's quite a lot, we don't want all of that. And then I would take a few of them out, and then we would just put occasionally guards around them, and then over time, I realised that we didn't need guards, so I stopped wasting the time putting them around it. And again, because we couldn't graze these areas, when we cut them drops, we rake them, and then we tried to make sort of mini cow pat piles, but they're not catalysed quite in the same way as cows manage. But this is the best we could do on the sort of small margins. And this was a really cool event. This was an oak just coming into leaf, and for no more than an hour, it was absolutely swarming in insects. And had I not come at quite the right time, I wouldn't even have seen this. But this is the type of thing that happened so frequently once we started to release the reins and let processes play out. These amazing little boom and bust opportunities. As quick as these insects appeared, so did the predators. Birds filling the trees, and as quick as they were arrived, they were gone. So it's just a really good sort of lesson. However, zoom out in Google Maps on your mind and look at vast areas of the UK, and we have this. It looks broad scale, and we can see really far, but it is very simplified. It's very flat, the water's going to run off this, flood down into the stream. You've got the only thing breaking up the kind of greenery is a bit of conifer plantation, and that is offering very, very little in terms of complexity and, for me, interest. There's a project I work with up in Yorkshire. I caught back up with her in January, and we went to another part of the site where they haven't started doing any work yet. And we looked at it and we both sort of sighed a little bit, and she's like, "You ruined this for me, Neil," telling me all about it. I was just like, I didn't play any part in ruining it, but it's, you know, it's really easy to see these sites and think, because you can see far, it makes you feel like you're in the wild, but that is not wild. This is a very, very, very large scale farm system that could be offering a lot more for nature, as it's clearly not offering all that much in terms of produce production. So it'd be really interested to come to you guys now and see what you think about the term rewilding and what it kind of means, or what you understand or what you think of when I say a word like that.
Is there a difference between rewilding and nature recovery? Because I'm hearing more and more nature recovery being used rather than rewilding.
Yeah, so my previous role was nature recovery lead. I set up a nature recovery department at Ecosulis. We're a rewilding business, but there is still there's still a negative association for some groups around that word rewilding. So what I would say is, not all rewilding is nature recovery, but not all nature recovery is rewilding. Rewilding is a tool in the tool shed, and it's appropriate in certain locations. It's harder to do at a small scale because, for me, rewilding is a slightly different term. It's quite a specific set of parameters that that confirm what that word is actually trying to deliver on a site. So yeah, they're the same and different depending which way round you go with it. So, but yeah, again, with one of the issues that the word had was actually the very first adventure that Rewilding Britain started. So they set up a project called Summit to Sea. It was in Wales, and they made a fatal error, well, a number of fatal errors, but one of them was having a map and drawing a line from the summit to the sea, which went through lots of different people's land, and saying, we need to fix all of this. So no engagement with anyone who owned any of that land until they hit a stakeholder meeting. And actually, when we get new staff, I tend to get them to look at that as a case study of what not to do, because it's a fantastic project. It's a great concept, going from the top of the summit all the way down to the ocean. It's a fully connected wholescapes ambition. They just set them completely off with the wrong foot and disengaged all of the people who could have played a role in delivering that. And that's what caused it to become, in some areas, quite a toxic word, which is why people are saying we're doing nature recovery, and if you're on board with the word rewilding, then they might use that, but it tends to come in and out. There's certain plans, people ask us to remove that word, but it's about a concept for us, really, rather than what it's called, basically. So you were going to give a suggestion as well?
Well, a net comes to mind, obviously, and that was, well, I read a book about it, and that's it.
Yeah.
I'm going to actually go next week.
Oh, brilliant.
That seems about, I know that the whole top predator thing and all that,
yeah,
etc., etc. But then that's the big oldest, well, big comparatively to the south of England estate.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago we went to Wild Oak again. It's only 80 hectares up the road, North of Stoke Road, and that's also part of Rewilding Britain, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, Rewilding Britain, yeah.
Obviously that's not smaller. And different everything.
Definitely.
Context.
Yeah.
But I was thinking now, what they talk about top predators. The top predator, not predator, but mammal. Sorry, I don't know the terms. Was they brought in longhorn cows.
Okay, yeah.
But because it has to be managed, it can't be just left.
No, that's
so
right.
You don't just do that and then go and leave it.
Definitely.
You've got to have an idea of what you want to achieve.
Yeah, and the smaller the site, possibly the more you're going to have to be active.
Yeah.
Which obviously then you drift on that continuum from full rewilding and a landscape with functioning species within it, right down to edge of conservation at the other end.
In both cases, you hear the owners say, or the people doing it say, it's extraordinary how quick stuff comes back, and over a period of time as well. Yeah, definitely. When you change that management, nature wants to respond. Often the trick from my side is trying to not
not know, but consider what might happen, because my intention is to sort of nudge and then wait and see how the land responds, and then if you have to, nudge again. So you need to have a few plans in your pocket for that. So, yeah, anyone else got thoughts on the word rewilding?
Exmoor National Park 3 years ago published their rewilding nature recovery plan, and they produced a map showing where all the land that was outside Exmoor National Park, how it could be improved in it. And again, the locals hated it because their land was included in plans which they'd heard a little bit about, but actually seeing that they're whatever. So you do be very careful about using that rewilding word, even though I'm totally for it.
Yeah.
But if you don't get the context of the word,
100%.
even though people who they knew it was coming along, they'd all been saying, so the various landowners, farmers, local authorities, county councils, parish councils, they'd all been saying, yes, we really want to see something happen. But when the map was published, they said this is going to be rewilded. Somebody got petrified. It was quite interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? The human dimension is a really interesting one. We tend to use the language of opportunity areas. So we've got a big project that's 5,000 hectares in Scotland, but the hope is to extend it beyond that with neighbouring farms within a wider cluster. And we were very careful around even down to it being called an enhancement plan, not a recovery plan, because again, lots of them are multi-year, multi-family generational farms. So, you know, the granddad who's maybe blocked some drains to reduce the water table and let the peat dry out so that he can graze it for a bit longer because he was paid to do it and instructed to do it under policy. It's not his fault that he's done exactly what we've asked of him, and that's often the case for a lot of land owners, is that they've done exactly what's been asked of them, and now we just need to ask them to do something slightly different. But yeah, same as if any of us, a map came through the door with a road through our lounge or a new footpath through the front door and out the back garden, you'd be like, yeah, no chance. So,
well, I mean, I think the word, the net association, I think it's a bit, there's something a little bit uncomfortable about all that, because you know, there is the competition between food production and rewilding.
Yeah.
And with the net sort of situation, you get the impression, I don't know if you're right, I haven't visited, the impression one gets is that, okay, this is a very wealthy family who've been able to do this as a pet project, and one doesn't quite understand how they've managed to finance it or where the funding's come from.
Yeah.
And so that's the one problem, is that sort of connotation, that sense, and that might be where some of the irritation comes from, is the sort of lack of understanding how it fits into the real world.
Yeah.
When and then there's the other problem, which is the competition for food thing. So, you know, at the moment, you know, food in the UK is abundant because we import so much, and you know, conventional agriculture produces huge yields, so that, you know, 8-9 tons a hectare for wheat.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
we can sort of compress food production hopefully into smaller areas.
Yeah.
Or import what we can't produce. So I think those are the tensions, and then the question would be, how does one logically decide which areas are best allocated to rewilding and which aren't? Of a particular landscape like this one here, you know, what proportion should be rewilded and what proportion should be given to food production?
100%.
So I think it's all of that. And then it is a question of how is it funded. I don't really know much about what's happening with BMG and how that relates to.
We get involved in quite a broad array of project types and also different ways of funding those. I guess let's unpack a few bits of that. If you take net, obviously they were really being propped up by subsidies, and they were really on very marginal land. So taking that out of production is probably, so in the wider industry, if you are doing a damaging practice here and I stop it, if we still need the thing that was being produced through that practice, that's called leakage. So I haven't fixed a problem. they're super complicated because all these things are interconnected, and I guess if you don't have to roll back much until pre-war time, and farms were more diverse, more varied, and actually that created niches for a whole load of farm species to evolve. And the problem is that space isn't there now for them in a more commercialised, industrialised way of producing food. My personal feeling is that we need more nature in more places, everywhere basically. It needs to be threaded into everything. In terms of rewilding, it's normally best to pick the areas that aren't actually commercially viable. As I said, they're being propped up by systems, and you might not even be producing all that much from those areas. A lot of the sites we've got up into Scotland and northern England, they are, again, without subsidies, which have changed anyway in very recent years. They're not making money from that production. So it's like a hidden cost at the moment within the system, which is the environment, and it's been racking up quite a lot of debt in the background. The general rule of thumb is that you protect the best spots for nature, and then you start with a really poor quality land that isn't producing much, and those are the hubs for nature. But ideally we want more nature weaved into more places.
So I think the RFPB had a target. I have an idea, it's kind of 30%. Is that right?
Yeah, they're part of this 30 by 30 sort of challenge, which is to try and set aside 30% of all of land mass. Weirdly, Ecosulis 10 years ago set an ambition for our business of 50 by 50. So threading wildness into 50% of the planet by 2050. So yeah, slightly more ambitious, but you know. But yeah, sorry, you were going to say about their 30 by 30 targets.
No, I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah.
That's a number that I've come across.
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's not drawn out of science, it's more of
it's an ambition, isn't it?
yeah, exactly, it's a half ambition. And, you know, I remember years ago being taught that about plant management, you know, and I'd say, oh, how much have you got to renovate this old orchard tree? It's just like, I never do more than 30%, and then the tree can respond. There's this sort of hidden 30% thing that tends to crop up, so that's probably where it came from, spitballing around a meeting, and then it got turned into a policy. But you know, 2030 is rapidly approaching, and most countries are at 10%, if that, and that's the more ambitious countries. So yeah, we're still a fair way off on
And
that.
I think the leakage thing is a really big problem because
100%.
invertebrates and small mammals in places like where we import loads of fruit and veg from, completely underregulated compared to Europe and the UK.
Yeah.
So apples and things coming from countries like that represent a huge export of biodiversity degradation.
Definitely. Yeah, so it's so connected and complex, and yeah, we're not going to definitely solve it all rapidly, but considering the impact that our activities have, and when we use the land and we extract stuff from it, there's a cost. And you were talking about food production as well in terms of volume and quantity. Again, sat here on an organic farm, it's not the weight you need to worry about, it's the quality of that produce, and we've sort of lost a little bit of that, so we might be eating more in terms of quantity, but we're getting less in terms of quality and the required vitamins, minerals, nutrients, all of that stuff. It's a really good book on that by James Rewilding, who's talking, I think it's called The English Pastoralist. Really, really good book, and he's talking about how in 1950, what in terms of like quality of our tomato, it had 4 times the amount of vitamins, minerals, and nutrients to now. So it might be 4 times, a quarter of the price, but you need to eat 4 of them instead of 1. So that doesn't quite. It's not as simple as these things can seem. Certainly, if you're just looking at kind of weight or volume. So yeah, definitely a complicated avenue we've fallen down there. Any other sort of thoughts on rewilding as well?
On the profitability of net, from what I've been told, is that it was very unprofitable before, and it is very profitable now.
Because it's a tourist industry.
They've got all sorts of things that they do, but
all kind of greenhouse gases involved, people travelling all the way to there, flying there from all over the world.
you know, you can it's changing the goalpost. You're talking about profitability. You know, they're much more profitable now.
Yeah.
Yes, people should be travelling, they should be flying, they should be cycling, all these things. But all of this is true, but that's a separate thing. But financially, they weren't profitable. Now they are, and the reason, you know.
And there's a lot more employees that work on that
Something
project
like
now
80 people compared
Yeah.
to 4.
100%. And they contracted it out, so they had like a farm manager and 2 farm hands.
Yeah.
And you know, now there's teams who run tours, take groups out. There's a wild sort of camping site set in the meadow. They've got their little outdoor kitchen and stuff, which is using the produce from the site. So yeah, it's they're definitely in a much more stable position than they were before. But yeah, again, it's not as straightforward.
Now become a flagship, really.
Definitely.
And Isabella Tree spoke as the spokesperson as well.
Yeah, and it's a beautifully written book as well, isn't it?
Yeah, the book's brilliant.
Yeah.
And the fact that she travels, she may travel everywhere, but at least she's promoting
Yeah.
the idea.
Definitely. Her daughter's released a really interesting paper about carbon stocks inside areas of scrub. So if you see in the carbon world, they tend to only measure above ground biomass. So she's worked out calculations for the biomass below ground. And then if you then add things like soil biomass, then you're really talking about a complex system instead of the carbon calculator might encourage you to plant a non-native tree in straight rows, which is offering nothing for nature. So yeah, they've continued to do a lot of really positive work. And like I said, it's quite a good flagship that changes the conversation and hopefully shifts us towards. It's not perfect, and there's still a long way to go in terms of understanding and approaches, and lots of things to address, like that leakage topic and how we actually connect and measure and even consider that. But it's definitely nudged the conversation forward vastly, which is great. So you were going to say?
No, I was just going to say that I mean, that has been a great example of what we can achieve.
Definitely.
We do need examples, because it's all too easy to criticise things, you know, when you're talking about them in rather in the abstract.
Yeah.
And the biodiversity, we have stayed there. The biodiversity when you walk around is amazing. The places now where there are the barn owls and different things. And of course, for the family, is a huge diversification project. Partly, I mean, obviously there's sausages in their farm shop cost an arm and a leg. But it's making money for the family. So, you know, economically, as a farming family, it's worked, and also as a huge. So, I mean, we could criticise it ourselves, having been there for various things. But you can't take away from the fact that it's a fantastic example of what can be achieved.
Definitely.
In that particular way.
No, 100%. Any other last sort of thoughts on the word? Yeah.
Are you going on beyond this? You're making us work, right? or is this for discussion?
No, there's more content than we're going to have time to look at, but I was just really interested because this word lands so differently with different audiences, and I have to present it, hide it, remove it, repackage it. So it's just really interesting when you get the opportunity to get different people's thoughts and opinions on it.
I've got a few comments. So I'm on the Chilterns Conservation Board, and we just finished writing the nature recovery plan, which all the AONBs are doing, and all the councils as well. Within that, we haven't got any rewilding. I don't think it's even mentioned at all in the entire thing. It's all about restoring semi-natural habitats, so chalk grasslands, heathland, woodland, fens, and so on. All that sort of thing. So it doesn't, within sort of conventional nature conservation, as we see it, even though we're quite ambitious about what we'd like to do, I mean, it's a wish list actually, because we don't have the powers to achieve any of this stuff. It's a wish list, but I've forgotten where I was going with that now. So the 30 by 30, so we have got very bold, the officers even who are dealing with this in detail, I've got very bogged down on that, because the 30 by 30 says something like wildlife friendly or protected for nature or something. It's a very vague phrase. It's very poorly defined within even within the sort of guidance from government. Yes, my point there was that that's really all about trying to restore previously managed landscapes, so semi-natural landscapes as they're called. My other point really is about, so I run the farm here, one of the farms here, and this has been organic 50 years this year. It has very, very high biodiversity, but it's all managed. So it's either a hay meadow, or it's grazing rotation, or it's an arable rotation, or it's a managed hedge, or whatever.
Or woodland.
So, well, I don't manage the woodland, only a tiny bit. But, so I do have concerns about rewilding, and I have concerns about NEP's promotion of it specifically, because they were saying basically they must have been very bad at farming. They were losing money in 1990. What the hell were they doing? Those were the big days. I don't know what they were doing wrong. And they said their land is very poor, but I know the area and it's not that poor. My question to them, which I would like to put to them, is why didn't they just go organic? So organic farming, they said they realised that they had no wildlife. It was appallingly species poor and habitat poor and everything like that. Organic farms have massively more, not only species but biomass of species, vastly greater habitat richness altogether. At least they can have. They don't always have. They certainly can have. So my sort of broader question, I'm quite open-minded about it, and I think what you mentioned at Caversham Park, for example, which is clearly a managed landscape, that's great. If you relax some of the management and you get more wildlife, that's fantastic. But within the farm landscape, my question would be, why don't people just go organic?
There's definitely a myth or a misconception, and it's happened weirdly organically through the process of changing business. And it was something that I witnessed at Caversham. So this guy came in, he was a sales rep, and he had been dealing with my predecessor. And he said, "Oh yeah, hi, I can't remember his name now." Just like, just finished my agronomy course. I was like, "Oh, okay, this sounds really interesting." And then essentially he was just a salesman for chemicals, hybridized seeds, and I was like, "Oh, okay, fine, well, I'll have a look. Come back in a few weeks. I'll think about if we need anything resources wise." And he came back and he turned up next time. I was like, "Neil, I noticed something on the sports field on the way in." It's just like cricket outfit. It's not even, it's there for a few employees to kick a ball around and have a cricket match on. No, worse than this. He went, "I noticed you've got a worm problem." I have a worm problem. I went, "Yeah." He's like, I was like, what should I do about this worm problem? He's like, "Oh, right." Flips to page 17. He's like, "Right, you're going to need this product. There's only 2 types of worms that cast, so we could wipe them out straight away." And I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, "And then you're probably going to need to reseed." I was like, "Oh, right, so I need some seed." It's like, "Yeah." And then this recommended some like rye grass. I was just like, "Oh, only rye, so that's going to be really helpful for creating a diverse sward here." He's like, "Yeah, but don't worry, you can add these agents to. These will do what the worms did, but better." And I was just like, and then we got to the end, I was like, "I don't think we need anything. I wouldn't bother coming back because we're not going to buy anything." And essentially, he'd given me a whole shopping list of things on a ridiculously invisible budget that I had, but completely not grasping the fact that whatever grows relies on the soil. And this is a lot of what's happened. People have been guided and given some artificial fertilizers, and yes, they've got some sort more top growth. Then they lose skills, expertise, knowledge, and so there seem to be this like lack of awareness on what they would do if something happens, i.e. a natural process happens in that soil system, and they're ill-equipped to work out how to address it. And a quick fix is buying this thing off of so-and-so. Luckily, there's a lot more of an awakening where those prices for those products, particularly fertilizers, has gone up and up and up, and more people are sort of saying, "Actually, if I keep buying that, I can't afford to farm." And now they're sort of remembering that there was a very high quality functioning system. I've been to a few of these regenerative farming events, and it does surprise me what's touted as the new is just what we knew before. Cover crops, companion planting, low till as much as possible, thinking about proper rotations. As people are throwing these things around like they're like new concepts that have just arrived, and there's people like yourself who've for many years already been organic farming. So yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? 100%. But you know, from us, yeah, rewilding is a thing we need to do to help catalyse nature. And you know, even in our most protected sites, they're still continuing to decline. And we often do a lot of work in these sites to hold them in some form of static state. And that's, again, something we've forgotten, is that nature is in flux. It's about cycles of boom and bust. And each of those new cycles creates a new opportunity for something. And we tend to just look in our own shorter lifespan with limited understanding of what these would look like played out over time. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting place. So.
You said something interesting, which was the comparison. I've sort of become quite fond of the idea of rewilding, or letting nature be.
Yeah.
I mean, it stores. I think it's probably the most efficient way of storing soil carbon is to just let it be.
Yeah.
Do nothing. But there were these. I've been quite attracted by the idea of closing the gate and walking away.
Yeah.
But you were just suggesting that isn't necessarily the best thing.
Yeah. Again, so should we let me just spin. Sorry, wrong way.
It's to close the gate, walk away, not to feed any people.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
What we do in our farm is very much about integrating nature recovery, if you want to use that word, and feeding people at the same time. And this is the critical factor, because many farms don't feed very many people. They don't have very much nature either.
Yeah.
The big problem with the whole planet, and particularly in UK, is agriculture, the impact agriculture is having. And as soon as we start to own up to that, and own up to the realities of what that actually means in the future, we're not going to really do a lot of rewilding.
No, that's right.
Yeah, although we'll have little pockets here and there, little oases, unless we can join those up into one complete metrics, they don't have any like effect that they should be having.
100%. And if you've got your hubs of rewilded nature sites, and you've got your softer, more natural and organic, more wild farmed areas, then you've got opportunities. They're not barriers. The thing is, if you've got an industrial farm, that's a barren area, and natural movement for a lot of species can't get across those barriers. So finding it, you know, it's not one thing or the other. There's some places rewilding is a great thing to do, and it will help a system. And where we're producing food, which is important because we all want to eat some food, we need to do that in the right places, in the right way, and in a more nature-friendly way, definitely. So, yeah, 100%. Should we move on? So this was just a little graphic that we used to put in. Again, a lot of traditional countryside management creates this fairly broad brush, more sort of like macro habitats. A lot of those key habitats that you were mentioning up in Chilterns as well. Whereas when we try to think of a rewilded landscape, you've actually got much more messiness, much more untidiness, and each of these create different niches. I don't know if you've ever walked from the glade in a woodland to a centre of a woodland. The noise of insects and birds will be much louder on that glade because it's on that transition between one block of a certain habitat type and another. So it's just about kind of making space for nature, and you know, this is what I said about doing at Caversham Park, taking it from very macro into these sort of little micro habitats and niches. I really love these Rewilding Europe principles because this is where you need to start. If you want to change something, you need to start on common ground. So I like to zoom out, as I said earlier, Google Maps in my brain, and really focus on some principles. And I love all of these because, you know, there is everything from working together, protecting the best, rewilding some of the rest, act in local context, focus on the long-term vision, you know, work at nature scale and let nature lead. These are all things we've been talking about already. Exchange that knowledge, think creatively. So for me, the essence of rewilding is about resetting the ecosystem, and you should really consider, as you do with your organic farming, the ecosystem in which you're producing things within. And that's kind of the difference than if you think of carbon or if you think of biodiversity. both of those are outcomes of a system that is functioning, and often in a super modified wider landscape system like the UK, that underlying system isn't functioning. So we do need to set about kind of resetting that system wherever possible, and then we will be able to get closer and closer to closing the gate, or at least come back through it less frequently, which I think would be really nice. And again, this is quite common in the kind of rewilding science. It talks about this sort of dynamism and ecospace. It talks about the kind of trophic level. Someone mentioned carnivores earlier. And it talks about these sort of 3 dimensions. So this is about it being complex, this is about dispersal, and then this is about disturbance. Again, that's what I was replicating. Again, funny story from Caversham. Even when something like the topper link pin broke, the implement dropped down, scarred the ground. I was like, oh no, I had to fix it the next day. And then actually that created this bare area of disturbance, and it stimulated loads of interesting things that were hidden in the seed bank to come back up. And again, it reminded me that the natural parallel to that is things like animals disturbing that soil. So from a nature sort of recovery and rewilding context, these are quite sort of key dimensions to think about. So what to do to kind of go about it? Again, we touched on something earlier. Often people talk about keystone species. I obviously couldn't mention that word without putting the one that everyone talks about, beavers. And then this is a great little graphic that shows the timeline from 2011 to 2014 of an area where beavers have been reintroduced. But I would caution people here in the fact that they are not setting about recovering nature or anything other than themselves. They're being a beaver, they're creating opportunities for themselves, and those opportunities do create a cascade effect, but they are, and that's why they're a keystone species. But if you change your zoom again and you're down into the soil level, ants often play that role as a keystone, moving nutrients, material, allowing water filtration to take place. So, but again, all they're doing is filling their own role and their void. Whereas actually humans, I like to consider the fact that we can actually form this role of a hyper keystone species. Now I say that because we're, as far as I'm aware, the only animal that can consciously choose whether the activities we do have an upgrading effect on a system or a downgrading effect. And sometimes we might have to accept their downgrading because we need a resource from it, but we can choose what our impact is and adapt our behaviour and respond to it. So, you know, I see that humans have a really important role to play because we need to balance what we need and want and how we go about generating those things and how we kind of act within the landscape. And again, this is something that the net's done quite well of highlighting is the role of herbivores, particularly large herbivores in a system. All of these things have been created by the presence of animals being in the system. So when I was at college, we were taught the typical story of vegetation cycles, and my lecturer stood at the front, as I am now, saying, yes, and all of the UK from coast to coast was covered in wood. And I was like, well, that doesn't really make sense, does it? Yes, no, that's exactly what I was like, yeah, but where is everything? Why have we got meadow plants, and why have we got insects that need those meadow plants that we were just walking through? He was like, no, coast to coast woodland, and I was like, it just didn't make sense. And then, so when I sort of saw those early papers coming out from Franz Vera talking about vegetation cycles and how they're missing a key interaction with all vegetation being animals. It's the reason things bother growing a spongy bark or thorns or an awkward shape, the way they respond and coppice. All of these are evolved traits to a pressure which is there all the time, and that was caused by herbivores. This was one that I really liked. Cattle had sort of poached an area, and I was like, oh yeah, it looks awful, we've left them there too long, and then down came all these butterflies and were drinking nutrients that sort of formed on all of these little puddles, dissolved in the water. And again, I love this was on a bit of horse poo. I think there was some Exmoor ponies on the side, and they're called poo demons, these little fungi that grow out the side of it. So yeah, it's really interesting, this interaction between vegetation cycles and larger herbivores.
Can I just make a point? We tend to forget that For about 10,000 years we had woolly mammoths.
Yeah, and like woolly rhinos, yeah.
In the British landscape, and a lot of our trees and shrubs actually developed in the later part of the evolution to cope with woolly mammoth.
Yeah, exactly.
Eating and pushing over.
Yeah, those mega herbivore were present everywhere.
10,000 years, but we've only been doing stuff for 3,000 or 4,000.
Yeah, exactly. Literally a tiny drip in the ocean of that timeline. You know, even places like Australia, they had giant sloths, giant kangaroos. You know, there. So yeah, that's why it's really important to consider the role of herbivores, because, like I said, we had a mega herbivore playing out a functioning role in the past as well. So I try to think about any landscape when I'm looking at it about these dimensions. It's about water, so the watershed. It's about plants, so i.e. communities and habitat types, and the animals that are playing a role in that landscape. And those are the things that I'm looking at when I'm working out how to nudge, when to nudge, and what to do to kind of nudge things along. And I put together a presentation for a rewilding course, and I decided it was a bit of a juxtaposition because they asked me to do a session on creating a rewilding plan, and I was like, let me nature lead, but I've got to do a plan. There's a little bit of a juxtaposition between those two sort of concepts, but there is some key things that you do when you're putting those plans together, and I kind of pulled them into a little bit of an ABC. So A is obviously start with the aim, with the ambition of the project, and the area that you've got. Into B, so think about what barriers there are, think about your borders, and by that I mean think beyond your boundary, because if you want nature to disperse and move from the landscape or to your site, you need to think beyond the constraints of your own site, and you need to think about what your baseline is, so what you need to consider, what you need to protect within that kind of work. This is a key one within rewilding, which was always cores, corridors and carnivores. It came from the US, not always that useful in this context, so I tend to think a bit more about cores, corridors and chaos, that randomised disturbance that's creating those niche opportunities for nature. And actually the other day on a talk I added another one in, which is actually community, because if you don't bring people in, a bit like that example we gave earlier, you're going to lose that connection, particularly for changing land, as I did at the BBC with 300-500 employees, whatever it was at the time. I had lots of people to disappoint, so trying to bring people along on that journey is really important. And then the three we touched on earlier, which was that diversity, dispersal and disturbance. And as I said, what's the goal is to try and make landscapes that are maybe looking a bit less like that, and a bit more like this. How are we doing for time? We're probably...
Got a good half an hour.
Okay, cool. So one thing that I often get sent as someone who develops projects is around tree planting. We touched on carbon. And my preferred go-to, where possible, is obviously natural regen. And then these are some ideas I came up with 5-6 years ago around assisted natural regen. So where you don't have the budget or the time or the opportunity or the desire to put a massive deer fence up to try and keep that deer pressure off. Actually, when we're cutting the hedges and coppicing, scattering that brush over natural regen, actually accelerates it. So the same way that these tubes create a little greenhouse, the brush does exactly the same, and I was trying to mimic the fall of a canopy of a tree, and that it tends to create this lovely little nursery and an area of protection for all of its sort of progeny to start coming up. So again, it's looking for those, how nature's done it, you know, and that's something people say to me, oh, you can't grow any trees without those guards. I was just like, that tree's 1,000 years old, that one's 500 years old, how old is your plastic? Not that old. So they were quite capable and able to grow without the plastic tube. And again, as soon as you go down the route of putting those guards on, it can impact and change what that tree does. So again, where possible, practical and appropriate, can you remove any of those barriers so you can let things move and disperse through the landscape. I don't know why I put that very green field in. Yeah, look at that. There's a little bit of something going on. So again, it's something I often come across is when we're looking at land is understanding when to nudge and how to nudge, is working out what systems are in more of a static state because of the land management that's been carried out. Here, again, you rightly point out we've got a few moles, but often areas like this that have been commercially seeded, often with things like Italian rye, they can struggle to reset on their own. If areas are particularly sheep grazed, you kind of create this mat. And there was one project where they said that they'd taken sheep off 15 years earlier and it didn't look much different from that. It just looked a bit less bright. And so again, it's whether you can think about resetting that. So another negative from here, we touched on watersheds earlier, is that if it rains, then that's going to come pouring down onto here, flush down into the little beck that's just down there, and end up shooting down. We've obviously, another year in which we've got another record for driest spring or whatever it happens to be. So, like, a really important thing is to have more water, spend more time on the land. That journey down to the sea should be as long as possible, and then these areas can remain moist and create new habitat and opportunity. But quite often sites like this, it'd be great if you can get some pigs in, cause some disturbance, and try and stimulate some bits that are in the seed bank. And again, water in the landscape, you might need to create some ponds. This was a friend of mine did a really interesting talk once talking about ghost ponds. So again, within the farmed landscape, we would have a lot more ponds and a lot more sort of temporary ponds. But as you put the cattle in, even on those clay soils that they've got down at net, the cattle going down to drink that water as it continued to shrink would compact the clay. But again, there's often, you don't want these features in the land if you want to be out, maximising the area-based payments or the area that you can put to the other crops that you might be growing. So getting water back in the land is a really important one. So we started touching on trees a minute ago, but I've got my slides in a rubbish order, so we kind of had to lose that thread and we can pick that back up now. But quite often, and it's really infuriating, I touched on the approach I took to tree planting all those years ago. Regularly, I get a very detailed tree planting specification land in my inbox, and I go, what are you doing? What's this? And it's got a species list and composition and various types of plastic and man-made furniture that's required, and even now including things like micro-rhizonal root dips and slow-release fertilisers, and
it's hugely expensive.
Water, and then suddenly it's £10 per tree to plant it, and lo and behold, and what tipped me over the edge was turning up to set up the guys, and the guys there marking it out, the client. I went, well, what do you want us to do here? And there was a copse in the middle of the field like this, and obviously there was natural regen creeping out. It was like, yeah, clear all that crap, and we're going to plough all of that. I was like, what, this? He's like, yeah, spray off all that. I'm like, do you want to spray off the oaks that have grown to put your ones that you bought from the continent, because they're even cheaper? And I was just like, right, I think I need to walk away from this type of planting. And my CEO, I sort of had a moment, and he went, completely agree. He went, what are you going to do about it, Neil? I was like, I don't know, I'm going to come up with a plan. So that's normally what we do. The amount of people who come to me for tree planting, who I end up telling them we might not need to plant any trees, but you go through that journey, as I did on site, and you say, why do you want trees? And it might be, we want to create a future ancient woodland. I was like, okay, now we know our aim, what are we trying to create here? And then I might say, why is it not there? We're mowing it, we've got livestock in there, whatever, this guy's getting me to spray it off, whatever it happens to be. So can I change something to make that start coming back? Then chances are you can. It might be there's no seed source. So you kind of go through this journey of and these various stages of development, so that you can hopefully at one point in the future end up with something that looks much more varied and complex, and not end up with that. Because these little things are baked into death, and if they're lucky enough that you spend enough time watering them, and they come out the top of this and they go, oh, they're doing really well, and they get about this high, and you go, take the guards off, and they don't know where the wind is. This is a 1.2 metre guard, so the tree has got this high before it even knows where the wind is. an acorn that has grown in the field, the day it opens, it knows where the wind is, it knows where the water is, and it lays down its resources to respond to that. So lo and behold, these things shoot out the top, and they go, take off the guards, and then they all limp over like this, and then you're having to coppice things, and it's, you know, best case, you get all of these off in time, and you've got a giant pile of plastic. And Tubex have completely nailed the market now, because you can pay them to recycle your guards now for them, so you can buy them for them, and then you can collect them and put them in bags, and then you can pay them to pick them up, and then they recycle them, and then you can buy them again. So they've created a great circular economy for themselves. None of it helps trees grow. It might protect them from things, but the worst is I now see specs with 1.2 metre guards, 1.4 metre guards, when it's not red deer on these sites. There's some row over here, but they don't need a 1.4 metre guard. And to make it worse, they've also put a deer fence around the whole thing. And then next door is an ancient woodland, which has now got much more deer pressure, because they're no longer able to spill out and nibble a few little tops over here. So back to that leakage topic, we kind of really need to think about what we're trying to achieve before we run off and pull a detailed sort of spec off of the shelf and end up pretending we're doing something that we thought we were, you know, something really good and creating new woodlands when we're not. And look, this is my early career cutting. This is loads of fungi growing under it. These trees were choked to death, or they're baked to death in the sun. And even if they get away, they end up like these horrible areas with nothing underneath, where I'm then having to fell trees and introduce understory. So we do need to try and play forward a little bit in our mind when it comes to woodland creation. So yeah, there you go. There was a few examples. Is there any other thoughts or questions?
Do you ever get to the point about food production? I know that's quite complicated, but do you ever get asked to rerun high-grade agricultural land?
We haven't been to date, no. And as a business, we probably wouldn't go down that route, because it wouldn't, you know, yeah. We always want to kind of be comfortable with what's being asked of us. There's a big challenge that's coming with B&G as a thing, because it's sort of shifting that narrative quite a lot, and there's many reasons why a farm might not be making money. It could just be because someone's not managing it properly, not because it's the wrong thing in the wrong place. So yeah, it's definitely a shifting. It's a shifting position that's sort of evolving there.
So what's B&G now?
So that's biodiversity net gain, yeah. So there's a drive towards people seeing that they can. What I found really strange is that there is a drive for businesses to show they're having a less damaging impact, hopefully net positive, or as they're trying to do with biodiversity, net gain. Now it's designed, it's a great idea, it's designed for developers. Here is my land, and you've got an ancient woodland, a pond, and a nice meadow. Now, if I want to build houses on it, I'll be penalised more if I build it on these high quality features. So it will lead me to the poor quality grassland over here, and I'm having less impact from my development. Great. And now they're going to want me to increase that by 10%. Great, that's really good. But now you've got these off-site sort of habitat banks, and that's driving people to go, which is great. So there's a different way for funding, maybe creates a new economy, but it doesn't penalise them if they do the wrong things. If you can game the system and be like, oh, it's easiest if I create grassland units. So it's not a great site for grassland, or don't ignore woodland. Yeah, well, they're not going to grow quick enough for me to get those units. So there's a potential that it can start shifting what people lead. You know, for us, we do some B&G projects where we've adopted a phrase which I coined in the business, which was nature first, metric second. If they are happy for me to come on and not even look at the metric and look at the landscape and say what would be great for nature, and then a colleague will go and do the baseline and the uplift of that, that's perfect, but not if they want us to be sort of gaming the system, or not if it could be used for something else. So.
I had a question about Caversham. Was my old friend Adam Howe doing your deer control over?
He was, yeah. How is Adam?
Well, he vanished some years ago.
I thought that was just to me. I tried to get him for a different project. He just fell off a cliff, didn't he? Yeah.
So that wasn't just about Adam, but You were obviously doing deer control. I think he was there during those years.
He was, yeah.
I used to hear about it.
Yeah. So
you were doing deer control.
Yeah. So I chose to.
So how did that fit in?
So that fits in because, again, for me, it's not about presence or absence of a species. It's about impact, and the population had got so high that they were really the only native things that I've seen them target regularly is ivy, which they love, but they also really love bluebells, and they'll eat the leaves. And much like you probably know in your garden, if you cut your daffodils too early, then the leaves haven't drawn enough energy into those roots and they'll come up blind, and that was starting to happen in our tiny fragment of bluebell woodland. So not only were they hammering all the ornamental stuff, I wasn't that bothered about that, but they were starting to impact the small area of bluebells that we still had, and they were getting a lot of territory marking and fraying on some of the more important trees. So I adopted a deer management plan. I looked at impact. I got Adam in. We worked out a plan where you could take the haunches, carcasses went off to the bean and wolves. I got permission to leave some of them in the lower field, which fed a lot of the scavenging birds and the kites. So I carried out a series of monitoring. We had our trail cameras. I looked at some impact. I let Adam guide on what that looked like as a behaviour. So yeah, we also do something similar with squirrels. We had a spike in squirrels at one point, and they were ring barking the top of like 50, 100-year-old oak trees, and the canopy was starting to die above that. The males were choosing to like territory mark at the top of the canopy. So yeah, sometimes you have to look at the impact, and that's what might guide when you need to act. So.
Which deer species were you taking?
We only had muntjac on site.
They're not actually native.
No, that's right.
I have a thing about that whole native thing written.
Yeah.
Let's go with it. They're not. Yeah.
Yeah, they are naturalised, but yeah.
So a serious question. So I hope you were not involved in the Lean Woods project.
No.
Okay, so that to my mind is the wrong kind of rewilding. I think it's wrong on every level. So
yeah.
This is.
Do you want to set the scene? I don't even know that.
So they're a large area of ancient woodland in East Kent near Canterbury.
Yeah.
I've forgotten who's leading on this actually. I haven't been there. I mean, I know the woods, but I haven't been there since they've done this. So they've introduced, I think, bison or some large.
Oh, it's Kent Wildlife Trust, isn't it? Yeah.
I feared it might be. I thought they should know better. So that's the wrong kind of rewilding, because ancient woodlands only cover 2% of England.
Yeah.
They're highly adapted to having animals excluded, large herbivores excluded, and to being coppiced, rotationally managed like that. That's what the ecology in them has been doing for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And they're putting in these blundering great herbivores, obviously feeding them, because there's nothing to eat in ancient woodland. There's nothing for a herbivore to eat at all in the ancient coppice woodland, only a tiny. So they're obviously feeding them there, they're adding nutrients. Everything is wrong about that kind of rewilding. But they think, I don't know what the sort of primary motivation was for this, but this is some sort of idea that we were to go back to an earlier period when woods had large herbivores roaming around. But actually our ancient woods have had herbivores excluded for at least the last 1,000 years.
Yeah, well, like you said, they're remnant managed areas. So, talk coppicing, you would be trying to protect those stumps, and many of our oldest trees are quite underwhelming when you get there because they're an old coppice stump that looks quite gnarly, and you're like, oh, I was expecting to see something. Don't know what I was expecting to see, but when you're like 1,500-year-old ash, you're like, amazing, and it's just got some 5-year-old stems growing out of an old rotting stump. So, but yeah, it highlights how long those areas have been managed for, doesn't it?
I think on this topic of bison, I read something about it recently, that they're looking at bison that have been in woodlands in Central Europe, but looking at it a bit more, it wasn't that they wanted to be in woodlands, it was because that was the only land that was left to them, because they were being driven off and hunted and kept off of the open plain. And so it wasn't that they were particularly well adapted. They were in woodlands, but not because that's where they wanted to be. And if they had a chance, they'd like to be out in a much more open piece of land. They could survive in a woodland, but they weren't really thriving.
Quite often you get that, what we look now, and we go, oh, they like here, you know, that's the suboptimal tiny little bit where they just about be able to hang on.
Exactly.
That's one of the downsides of focusing on single species though, is that you, put all your eggs in one basket, but you might spend a lot of time and energy creating areas that that species actually isn't that fond of, which is why we've probably not seen things increase and sometimes still decline no matter how much effort we put into them. That's one positive about the rewilding approach, is that it's about the system, and then, you know, we're in the midst of a biodiversity and a climate crisis. I get regularly people in these plans saying, oh, well, we need to climate proof the planting design. I was just like, okay, but we don't entirely know what that looks like. We can consider what a shifting climate might look like, but we don't actually know. And personally, I think if we create connected, diverse functioning systems, they will be able to adapt. We will no doubt go through a bottleneck, and some species will be able to optimize from that, a bit like me changing the management. And some species, you know, again, often you get going, oh yeah, get rid of all those weeds, and it's pioneer plants that are just in a different system. So yeah, creating spaces where things can be resilient and adapt is probably the best thing, rather than going, well, I think it'll be much more suited to Douglas fir or some Japanese pine, we're going to put those in. And it's just, yeah, it's a little bit strange, isn't it?
On the question of large herbivores, do you think that natural, wild herbivores do a good enough job, or do you think one does need to introduce domestic ruminants?
It definitely, again, each herbivore has a slightly different role in a natural setting. Ideally, if you introduce a guild, you're going to vary that, but you're in,
guild, what's that?
so as in a mixed selection of different types of herbivory pressure. A lot of our traditional rare breeds play that role really well. If they've got horns, then they're gouging and tearing and creating these little niches. You get specific fungi, spiders that have all evolved for that specific disturbance. So yeah, I think we don't have enough of a broad selection of that in the wild landscape. It tends to be deer that browse in quite a similar way, but just mainly around height. There's a bit of preference still within species, as in plants that they target, but 9 times out of 10, without that top-down predator, the secondary issue you get is that you just get intense browsing. So the problem by not having those predators at the top is that the livestock or the deer stay in one place overgrazing, whereas if that is being moved through the landscape, then that is a randomised disturbance event, not eating everything and then it pops up a bit more and you eat all of it. So, you know, historically, all of these animals would have, you know, one eye onto the hilltop looking for a pack of wolves, they'd have one eye looking over to the woodland for lynx, they'd sort of have ears pricking up looking for eagles above. So there's this sort of landscape of fear that's created by that presence of having predators in the landscape. And same as all of us, if we don't have to move, then we don't bother, you know. So that's the main issue. It's not that it's the time they spend there browsing and the fact that they're not disturbed is more of an impact on the landscape and that natural change of vegetation, rather than necessarily too many missing types of browsing profiles. So.
Yeah, the disturbance also reduces their fertility in effect. Far fewer red deer calves come through and survive if we have quite a good top predator pressure, because they just, as you say, they sit around and they have their calves and they just suckle them and they just all survive. Whereas if as you say, wolves don't have this to eat, but just to shove them around, and then half the calves will probably die because of the determinant factor. Which sounds cool, but would be a more natural.
It's a more natural limiting factor, and that's it's a really good point actually. And you know, a lot of animals do that delayed fertilization, delayed implantation. It was a really random story I got told years ago. It was a local guy, a badger had been hit on the road by Caversham, and I just got the local badger guy just to log it and move it out of the way, and he said there was a picture we were talking about, and he told me these two really interesting stories. That there was a picture of a badger track moving along next to a footpath, and for some unknown reason the badger track sort of did that and then kept going, and it was only years later he found a really old picture and there was a tree there, and this is the boundary mark, so even though there wasn't an obstacle there, they just followed that territory mark that they'd created. And the other one was that this woman had clipped one coming home, so she took it back to her stables, and it ended up becoming, the badger of the stables, and they kept it in its own little stable at the end. Well, 2 years after they had it and it's been on there on its own, it gave birth, and they were just like, who's been in with the badger? This is slightly alarming. And again, it's because they do this delayed fertilisation or implantation, so it's a defence mechanism for that pressure, and yeah, they quite easily will, choose to either leave a youngster if they're too disturbed and stuff.
How do you know it wasn't a virgin bird?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I should have thought about that one slightly longer. I did rule it out quite quickly, but I'm feeling like I've, not really given it the attention it needed now. Any other sort of thoughts or questions?
Just one of the things, I take it that, when James and Holly say that the sort of biodiversity of the Harwood States really positive and rich, that, you know lots about this and I don't. But one of the things I've always noticed about Harwood is that there seems to be remarkably little bird song in the woods, which I spend quite a lot of time walking in. And it's really changed this year. And I think the reason is, according to our forestry, is that the grey squirrels are, being massacred left, right and centre. Yeah. And that seems to have made a huge difference. They massively predate on the eggs and the fledglings as well. So yeah, they seem to have definitely dipped. It's something I've noticed in a lot of other places. But yeah, birdsong's a really nice way of measuring that. One of the tools we use at the moment is around acoustic detectors and trying to sort of balance that natural noise in comparison to anthropogenic noise. What would be really nice, I'm desperate to try an experiment about listening to soil. It'd be really great if, when I get the detector up and running, I could come and listen to some areas of the farm.
We've had someone come around and do some of that from
Brilliant.
University.
Yeah.
And you can actually pick up different fungi and bacteria in the soil.
Yeah.
He's trying to develop a program that you can stick on your mobile phone. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Idle dream, but he reckons that in time you can put your mobile phone on the soil and it will give you a readout what's going on. Yeah. I think it sounds a little bit too far-fetched.
Yeah. There's quite a few steps from where we are to there. At the moment there's a really good program.
But apparently that technology is in development.
Well, it was a few years back, we met up with one of these eDNA companies, and they were saying about how they can tell all of this stuff from the soil, and it's just too cost prohibitive at the moment. And they were saying they could look at various fungi. They can't go down to species, so it's just a rough, broad group of fungi. And anyone who knows anything about fungi is that there's a whole spectrum of different roles that are played out within each group. So it's not very helpful to have a broad brush group. And it was, they were suggesting something like 5 to 7 collection points at 350 quid per hectare. And I've got this 5,000 hectare site in Scotland, so that doesn't track very well as a cost. If I, for us it's about getting data, but then not spending all your money on saying that it's 0 or 1. It's about having that money left to kind of get on with the work. But yeah, that'd be great to
we do have a very comprehensive eDNA survey done on both my soils and also James's soils.
Oh yeah.
And it was done within rotation, looking at rotation without good. And every point of rotation is completely different fungi and bacteria.
Yeah.
And your fields are completely different from mine. Same soil type, the other side of the hedge, a complete and totally different picture. Yeah. We don't understand anything about it, right? No idea what all this information means, and no one could actually tell me, but it's a huge difference from one year to the next, depending on what crops we grow, what years we have, what your animals are doing, and it's a completely different story from year to year. And no one can tell me what that actually means.
Yeah, But that's the problem, we've got this huge list of stuff and didn't necessarily mean all that much, and if I'm going to use it as a tool to tell me what to do where or how well a certain technique is, you know, as someone works practically, I want to know, have I done something right, do I need to do something different, and what should I do more of or less of? And it was a whole load of information that was slightly meaningless and cost lots of money. So I think they needed to work on that a bit and come back to us.
But your intuition tells you, doesn't it, whether the project's working or not?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. You know, I read an article the other day about a new practice. I was like, what the hell is this? Land snorkeling. And I was just like, well, I've got to read this. I like snorkeling, but what is this telling us to do? And weirdly, this is exactly what I do when I go out into the woods or into the countryside. I move really slowly, so I don't know if you've ever snorkeled, but it's not about charging along. It's about almost floating and like taking in all of the detail. Is exactly how I move through the landscape. And it was a Ray Mears book I read years ago, and he was saying the first thing he does is sit down for 10 minutes. Again, being Ray Mears, he makes a tea or a fire or something like that, but sort of sits down and connects to the landscape. And it's a really powerful way of taking in all of the detail, and by doing that you see things and you're able to tell a lot more from that time. Yeah. So did you have your hand up?
Well, because somebody said technology.
Yeah.
I just have to say.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. And the amount of heat it generates.
Yeah.
The amount of water it uses is stopping all sorts of other things happening.
100%.
And it's so lovely to be able to get all the data, and that's all this magic. So I see, and it's like, oh, this is so cool. I can tell it to whatever grass, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious I'm using up the world by doing it. And they're using land for data, for instance. Nice land. I mean, not so nasty land, because we love that. But some pretty unpleasant land in town somewhere.
Definitely.
So it's a big dilemma, I think, for the human brain. Because we love progress, we love seeing new things and what it is.
Yeah, it's trying to not forget what we had already learned and not be distracted only by new and shiny. We generally think that, you know, some people go, yeah, we need more carbon capture. It's just like, we have carbon capture, it's all around us. And not only will it be capturing carbon, it will be creating biodiversity, attenuating water, cleaning water for us. We've forgotten all of those secondary, tertiary, and then some activities that we get from systems. And yeah, obviously we can't model them in an accurate way, just like we can't model a complex woodland in the same way that we can a monoculture in neat, even rows, even spaces apart. So yeah, it's a tricky dilemma because we're sort of doing this and not taking that knowledge with us when we go. So. Oh, any last questions? I'm conscious of time.
How optimistic are we for the next sort of century or so?
About what?
About biodiversity in this country and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I'm always a glass half full kind of guy because I see opportunities in everything. I've seen it work. I know how easy and simple it is. So I've put my energy into creating plans that have the best outcome for the least effort. They don't have known parameters. I'm not targeting something specific. I'm targeting activities and nudging and watching. You know, there's some of these projects up in Scotland that are thousands of hectares. I've come in with a wildly smaller budget because there's a whole different approach to what that looks like, and letting nature lead is a much more useful way of doing it. So I am super optimistic that the weird thing is, all of the solutions are really simple, but to deliver them is really hard. Someone the other day said to me, what's the best thing we can do for this, dry weather and water quality issue and protect seagrass beds? I was just like, it's upstream. If you put a buffer on every river, it would probably be filtering. You probably wouldn't need to change your land management. Obviously if you change timings, remove chemicals, all of those things will stop. But if you put an appropriate sized buffer on every watercourse, not only would you create a corridor for beavers to move around and repopulate and create more water in the landscape, but that would probably be the simplest and easiest thing to do. However, it's the most complicated thing to do because they've got all of these landowners that you need to tell them to do something different with their land. if I start drawing that on a map, I'll disengage even more people. So it is a trickiest bit is people and policy and making things happen. But yeah, often for me the solutions are simple. They're nature-led, and I'm super optimistic that we'll get there. Cool, there you go. I feel like that's a nice note to end on. Really.
Thank you so much.